Now, as a next step, I want to focus on this form. And I want to make sure that in this application, support tickets can be created and will then also be shown once they have been created. Now, for that, we of course have this new ticket component where we output the input and the text area wrapped into a form. And of course, you did learn earlier in the course how you can handle the submission of a form. You can listen to the ng-submit event, but you can only do that if you also make sure that the forms module is available to the component that is trying to listen to ng-submit. Because ng-submit is not some built-in default browser event, but instead an event that is emitted by Angular for forms which are controlled by Angular. And Angular will automatically start controlling forms because it essentially has its own form component that takes over this form, but it only does so if the component where you're using the form is importing the forms module. So therefore, in the new ticket component, in this imports array here, you also must import the forms module, which then is imported from @AngularForms. With that added, you can start listening to ng-submit and trigger some method whenever this form is submitted. And that is what I want to do here. So I want to trigger a onSubmit method. And of course, for that to work, we must make sure that in a new ticket component, we have such a onSubmit method like this. With that, if I console log submit it here to check whether it works, and I save all my files, if I open the developer tools here and I click submit, I get submitted here. So that's working. Now, of course, the goal not just is to listen to this submit event though, but instead we also want to make sure that we get hold of the values that have been entered by the user, so that we can use them in the onSubmit method to, for example, send them to some service or use them in some other way. And that's what we'll work on next. So how can we get hold of the values that were entered by the user into input and text area? Well, there are different ways of getting hold. One way would be to use two-way binding with ng-model, and you did learn about that earlier before, and I'll get back to that in the future, but for the moment I want to show you an alternative approach, because this section here is about diving deeper into Angular and working with templates and the user interface, and therefore I want to show you an alternative way of extracting the values that have been entered into those inputs when they are submitted. And one alternative way of getting hold of the entire element, actually, and therefore also, if we want to, of the value that has been entered here, is to store that element or a reference to that element in a so-called template variable, which is a feature offered by Angular, not a standard browser feature. And you do store an element in a template variable by adding a special attribute to that element. An attribute that starts with a hashtag. That's important. And then any name of your choice, like title input. But this is up to you. The hashtag at the beginning is important though. This creates a template variable, and that's an Angular feature where the element to which this variable, this special attribute here, is added is stored in that variable. And that variable is now available anywhere here in that template. Which means we can, for example, pass it to onSubmit without the hashtag here though. The hashtag is just important to create that variable, so you use it when you add it on the element that should be stored in the variable. If you then refer to that element anywhere in your template, you use the variable name without the hashtag, like I'm doing it here. So with that, this input element will be passed as an argument to onSubmit. So to get a better understanding of what exactly is stored in that title input thing here, let's go to onSubmit. And there, let's accept an argument, a parameter, which I'll name title element. The name is up to you though. And let's set a type for this parameter, because since we're using TypeScript, we need to let TypeScript know which kind of value will be received through that parameter. Hence, you must add a colon here and then tell TypeScript which type of element that is. And we can see which type of element it is if we go back to the template and we hover over title input. Here you see that it's of type HTML input element, which is a type that's built into TypeScript in the end. It is a type that describes the underlying DOM object of such an input element. So the type here should also be HTML input element, written like this. Make sure you get the casing right, otherwise you'll get an error. Well, and with that, we can of course log this title element here to see what's inside it. So if I do all that and I save it all, if I again click submit here, you will see that the input here is logged like this. Now that's a bit hard to analyze because for convenience reasons, the Chrome DevTools actually output that element as an HTML element here. But actually what we get is an object, a JavaScript object. And the Chrome DevTools will output it as an object instead of giving you that convenience if you use console dir instead of console log, which is a different way of logging it to the console. With that used, if you now click submit, you will get an object which you can expand, and you then see all the properties that exist on this object. And these are all default properties that are set and controlled by the browser because we're accessing the default DOM object in the end, the default object that is created by the browser behind the scenes for that input element. So this has nothing to do with TypeScript, nothing to do with Angular. You could get hold of that object with just vanilla JavaScript as well. Of course, not by using that template variable syntax here though. That is Angular specific, but the object that is yielded by this syntax is the standard browser input DOM object. That's just important to understand. And you can learn more about that default object and which methods and properties exist on it and what they're all about if you, for example, visit the official MDN article for HTML input element. You find a link to it attached. Now, one piece of data we can extract from that object is the value property. If you scroll down here, you will find a value property. And that's interesting because if I reload here and I enter something here and I click submit, you will see that now if I scroll down to that value property, the entered text is stored in there. And that would be an alternative way of extracting it. So if I wanted to get the entered title, I could get it by accessing title element.value like this. And then I can log the entered title like that, for example. If I do that and save that all, if I again enter test here and click submit, you see that is being output. And that would be an alternative way of extracting the entered value. Is it better than using two-way binding? Not necessarily, though it might be because it does not update some value on every keystroke behind the scenes. But most importantly, it's simply an alternative. An alternative you'll see in some projects, and therefore an alternative you should be aware of. Because of course this is an absolutely fine way of getting hold of the entered input value. So template variables are another very important component and template related feature offered by Angular. And you can really become creative with them. For example, we don't have to provide the entire object as an input to onSubmit if we actually only care about the title in there. We could change onSubmit and expect to get the title, which should be of type string, and the ticket text, which should be of type string. And then we could just log the title here and also log the ticket text. Now, of course, we would have to change the template because currently I'm passing the entire DOM object and not just the title. But of course, since title input is that underlying input element object, we can also access .value here and therefore pass just the entered value to onSubmit when the form is submitted. And to also get the text that was entered into the text area, we can also add a template variable to that text area and get the text input and submit that as a second argument to onSubmit. And now we would do the extraction work here in the template and get the extracted values in the component method and in the component class, therefore. And that is simply an alternative way of using those template variables. With that approach, of course, if I enter something here and I click submit, I do get those values. So that works the way you would expect it to work.